Tanchikiawao. Hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast on CFCR Community Radio, 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 Territory, cfcr.ca. This is your favorite auntie, Andrea Letting Dishni Kashoon. My name is Andrea Letting. Call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host over this next half hour. I am part settler, part relative, and 100% ally in relation to everyone. I'm just me, not a card-carrying member of any Indigenous nation, but I am loved, adopted, related to, and accepted by many, rejected by a few. Haters gonna hate, relators gonna relate. I am blessed to have Indigenous relations in my family, and secretly I may love them a little bit more than the rest, but only because they are the first peoples of this land who welcome all the guests. I'm also Irish and Scandinavian and a little bit of mystery, and that's the way I was raised. Strongly anti-colonial and justice-oriented with a big related heart for all. I most empathize with my Batoche Métis friends and family and that history and culture growing up, and as an adult have continued to try to live that Mio Pimitsawin, that beautiful good life. So from the fringes of the sash, I situate myself as a relative and an ally and welcome you, my listeners, as brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins in the homelands. Let's welcome our relative tonight. So I am really happy to welcome Shannon Loutitt, my sister from another mister. And just to tell you a little bit about her, she's a proud Korean Métis woman, a mother, and an honor runner who also happened to co-found IISB, International Indigenous Speakers Bureau. The motto of IISB is Inspire, Empower, Uplift, and that is what she does day in and day out. She also has the nominated title Kick-Ass Canadian alongside the likes of Chris Hadfield and Clara Hughes. She's been honored by Harvard University, the Saskatchewan Legislature, and the Canadian Senate for her passionate acknowledgement of unsung heroes. As a Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal recipient, Shannon understands what it means to go the distance. Whether she's running the Boston Marathon to commemorate Tom Longboat or running 100 miles in 24 hours to bring her grandfather's spirit home, honor runner Shannon Loutitt is not afraid of a little challenge when it comes to ensuring our stories are told. Her passion for bringing together our past and present to trailblaze a better future, along with her extensive business experience built over several years in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, have prepared this powerhouse mover and shaker to become the heartbeat behind the International Indigenous Speakers Bureau. Not only is she the co-founder of IISB, but also the CEO. So welcome, Shannon. I'm so excited to have you here.
Oh, Tanchi, Andrea, sister, thank you so much for having me here. I feel truly blessed. I'm honored to be here with you on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon, place I've called home for the past 20 years, and to be able to share with you a bit about ISB. And so I'm super excited. But before I do, I just like to provide a little bit of context to you and to your listeners about why ISB. On December 26, 2004, our world witnessed the deadliest tsunami in our history. Over 200,000 souls from 11 countries, stretching from Africa to Thailand, lost their lives that day, and millions more were forever changed. But of all of those impacted by this devastation, there was one community that was left virtually unscathed. These people knew the tsunami was coming. Long before any of the weather stations or scientific technology could detect that there was even a problem, they knew, and they knew what to do about it. You see, these people's culture and their remarkable lens on life had been preparing them for generations. And because of that, all of them survived, even though they actually live right there on the ocean. These phenomenal beings are the Indigenous people known as the Sama-Bejo. Tansei again. As you know, I'm Shannon Loutitt. My Ishnabi given name is Kishipa no Tinakwe, meaning tornado woman. I am a proud Korean Métis woman born and raised in Treaty 6 territory alongside my Cree, Métis, and Dene family. I come from a long line of trappers and Indigenous land people from the north, and I am the proud first granddaughter of Métis Kay and Paul Loutitt, and the granddaughter of First Nations Cree Lawrence White from Alexander Reserve. And yes, I am the CEO and co-founder of the International Indigenous Speakers Bureau. And we're the first and only international Indigenous Speakers Bureau in the world. And yeah, so I'm really proud of that. But to give you a little bit more to that story that I was telling you, there are 370 million Indigenous people around the world in over 70 countries. And they share, like us here, a very similar lens to that of the Sami-Bejo. And along with it, generations and generations of knowledge and expertise and solutions that have been nearly non-accessible until now. IISB was founded on the belief that by bringing together our Indigenous experts and the Western world in a way that is mutually respectful and honoring, and where we can actually see and hear each other, that we can create a world of unlimited possibilities. Possibilities that, of course, would benefit our generations and generations to come, possibilities that could help to amend the history, and definitely possibilities that would make a change in the way that we see and do things, and potentially save a lot of lives. So on that note, I have one last little story I want to share with you, to give you a little bit of context of me, and again, about the heartbeat of IISB. In 1904, the community of Athabasca, Alberta, was devastated by an unexpected flood disaster. It was Spring River breakup, and all the ice had gotten backed up into the channel, and all the water came back into the community, and it was flooding everything, including the Hudson Bay Company's post that was right there on the river landing. And in that post was all the staples for the next year for the people of the North, from their medicines to their flour to their, salts and so forth. And so the Hudson Bay Company needs to get help, and they need to get help really fast. And so they sent two messengers, because they never do anything solo. They always have to do it, in twos. They dispatched one messenger from the community of Perryville, which is 20 miles south of Athabasca. And that young man went by horseback from Perryville to Fort Edmonton, about 80 miles. The other messenger, which we discovered, was a Métis mail carrier, and he went by foot, and he went right from Athabasca, the whole 100 miles. He made that trek through flooded terrain in 16 hours, an hour quicker than the fellow that was sent on horseback. It would be 100 years before his family would find out about this heroic deed. But it didn't change the impact of that story that never got to get passed down. It inspired thousands of people, including his granddaughter, who was inspired by his strength and resilience, and whose life would be forever changed, and who would go back and rerun his 100-mile route to honor him and to bring his spirit home, and then would go on to further embrace his inspiration and his story by creating an organization that was dedicated to sharing other Indigenous stories so that more lives could be changed. And if you haven't guessed, that's organization is the International Indigenous Speakers Bureau, and that heroic Métis mail carrier was my grandfather, Billy Loutitt. So thank you for letting me share that with you.
It's a pretty amazing story. And so tell us about your journey through the honor running and through IISB and what you've learned.
For sure. Well, I mean, that's a long story. I'm not sure what point you want to start at, but in a nutshell, I can tell people that when I was 32 when I heard my grandfather's story. And prior to that, I mean, I had some great times playing sports in high school, mainly baseball and weekend tournaments, and the gatherings that went with it. Let's just say, and some volleyball. But as far as running, that was not something that I ever really thought much about or really had an interest in. But you've probably heard this story before, Andrea, where when I first heard my grandfather's story was at my aunt's funeral. And at funerals, it's funerals and weddings that you see family that you haven't seen in a long time, right? And so I happened to see my cousin, who I hadn't seen in about 10 years, and she shared with us that she had just discovered this story about our grandfather, and the community said they were looking for participants uh, descendants of the family to participate in this race. And so I couldn't even, when in the moment when she asked me that, you know, and she just told us this story about him running 100 miles, I couldn't even wrap my head around how does a person run 100 miles, let alone do it in 16 hours. Like, I was like, is that even humanly possible? Is this like a far off legend? Like, what is that, right? And sure enough, you know, it was something pretty incredible. But in that moment when she asked, she also said, "Hey, we should do this race that is there to honor my grandfather," right? Which is how this community was keeping my grandfather's story alive. And without even knowing what I was agreeing to, I said, "Sure, okay." And then when I left the funeral, I asked my partner, "Okay, well, they've got this race for my grandfather. It's called a triathlon. What's a triathlon?" And he looked at me and he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I agreed to do it and it's in 4 months, but I don't know what exactly it is." And so, and at that time, I had just, you know, given up a smoking habit of 17 years. I had a $5 garage sale bike that I didn't even know gears actually had a purpose. I just thought they were kind of a, you know, a thing to say, oh, I got a 10 speed. Oh, I got a 12 speed. You know, like I really didn't know the gist of that before. And so of course running was not something that was even on my register either. So making that commitment in that moment when I decided to do this for my grandfather, I learned one of the most valuable lessons I would ever learn in my life. And that was to come from my heart and not my head. And if ever there was a message that I could give people is let your head be the tool that helps you, but let your heart be the captain of your ship. So your heart and your spirit, right? Because that will guide you to all the magic and the mystery and the adventure in the world that you're seeking. And literally, that's what happened to me. That's what I learned in that moment. My grandfather's spirit, I credit for waking me up. And when I made that commitment, because all I wanted to do was just honor him. I just wanted to say, thank you, Grandpa. You know, we never actually been met because he passed on long before any of the grandchildren were born or the great grandchildren. And but he did something so heroic. And as an Indigenous person, one of the things that we did long before interruption from the colonial history is honoring was a big deal for us. Big deal that we celebrated each other. We celebrated each other's successes. A lot of people talk about how, oh, we're very humble people. We don't talk about ourselves and don't boast. Well, that was because we didn't have to. The community made sure that you were celebrated. That was something that was so important and so integral in our communities. And it was not a need to have to go out and seek it yourself. And so, anyways, but that history kind of changed that a little bit, right? So I've kind of gone off track here, but
Well, that kind of leads nicely into like why you do what you do with IISB, you
yeah,
know? So do you
yeah,
want to
yeah,
talk a
it
bit about
is.
that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I definitely say that for me, I'll have to go to a different part. The seed was planted many moons before that, but the roots the roots were really made from my honor running experience with my grandfather's spirit, right? And so to go back to where ISB began for me, I would have to say, and I'm sure if I look back, I'd find, you know, remnants of other things that were leading me in this direction. But the one point that is very um, etched in my mind is when I worked for a construction company in Fort McMurray, and my project manager at the time, when he discovered I was Indigenous, because of course I don't have the stereotypical traits that you know, a lot of the Western world thinks means Indigenous, and so he was non-Indigenous and he wanted to share this story with me. And so he told me, he said, Shannon, he goes, you know, a few years back, the company was called out to a project where a newly built dam had just sprung a leak. And so if you can imagine, it costs millions of dollars to build a dam. And for it to spring a leak, that's kind of a big deal. It's like, what? You know, what went wrong here? And so he said they were called out to try and go and fix this. And so we went out there with a crew, and a part of the issue when they tried to fix this was, in order for them to fix the leak, they actually had to stop the leak. And everything they were trying was not holding up to the pressure because it was so far down in the upstream of the dam. And they called in experts from around the world. They were calling them all over, like, how do we do this? And they tried a number of things. And then he said about a week or 10 days into them being out there, he said this First Nations trapper came by and asked him, what's going on? And my boss told him, oh, we got this leak in this dam, and we got to fix it, and every day gets more and more critical. And he said, like that, the trapper just looked at him with the most stunned look. And my boss is like, yeah, we got to stop this leak before we can fix it. And the trapper just looked at him and said, I can stop that leak for you. And my boss thought, yeah, right. What's this trapper going to do for us? We got, the best of the brains all over here, right? And like that, my boss just kind of looked at me and said, I could, and the trapper said, I could fix that for you in a day. And my boss thought, oh, no way. Well, we're all ears here. If you've got ideas, like, shoot them out. We're here, And like that, he said, the trapper said nothing else, turned around and walked away. And so my boss thought right away, oh, he didn't expect me to call him on his bluff. He was just bluffing me, right? Well, the very next day, that trapper came back. He came back with some beavers, threw them in the upstream of the dam, and that leak was stopped within a few hours. And there's two things that happen. One, of course, it's an incredible story, right? Like, about just how much money they would have saved if they would have had an Indigenous person with their Indigenous perspective there, telling them, no, do this, because it's their territory, just a whole different lens, right? And the other part was, when I watched him tell the story, I could see, and it was like something woke up in me, because I realized that we see the world differently. Like, something that he thought was so like as if landing on the moon, like so out there, right? And he was so proud to hear about it, and I thought that was great. But the big thing was, for me, is like, I grew up with trappers, like my family are land people, and I'm like, wow, Indigenous people really do see the world differently. And because of it, I wouldn't have articulated it like that back then, but I just knew there was something there, right? So it would take many, many more moons, a lot of honor running, and my grandfather's spirit taking me here and there to get me to this place where I met a couple of amazing gals. And I don't have the permission to say their names, so I won't say it, but I'm sure a lot of people know from the beginning. One of them, she's an amazing, amazing woman who has done many events and has a really huge heart dedicated to our Indigenous people, and is very passionate in what she does to try and make sure that Indigenous people are honored better, And as an event planner and having her own event planning company, it was one of the things that she shared with me that she didn't, that just bugged her to no end, and that she wanted to change, was that Indigenous people weren't being remunerated in the same way as non-Indigenous people, for one, and that was a big deal, and totally so. And then the other gal that worked with us, she's, besides being, the most incredible cheerleader, she is very, very gifted in her communications and graphic design and so forth. And so she was super helpful in a number of areas, including in helping us to recognize right off the hop that we had to make sure the world saw our Indigenous people as the superstars that they are. And when I say superstars, I don't mean it like how it used to be like, oh, you're better than or whatever. I mean, what they carry inside them is just an amplification of all their ancestors right there. Like, it's something so precious and so incredible that we needed to be able to show the Western world that. And we also recognize really quickly that the Western world sees the world in a certain way, and it's not about right or wrong. It's about their expectations are like this, and I consider it like a language. They expect communications to be a certain way, And so posters with this kind of thing and bio and all that kind of stuff is required for them in order to process stuff. We needed to make that happen for our Indigenous people because, as you know, we have moccasin telegraph. That's enough broadcasting right there. It can tell you. And so a lot of our speakers don't need professional speakers portfolios, and there's never been anybody out there to represent Indigenous people. So how would they know, right, what goes into it? So yeah. Anyway, so those two amazing gals were paramount in helping us to launch this organization and really get it going and so forth. And then you go down the journey, life happens, and one had to leave right away, personal reasons and new adventures. And then myself and my other partner, we came to a crossroads, and it was decided I would take over the business. And so it was after that about 3 years of working really diligently to do some revamping. So I feel like I'm taking up all the airtime.
You're supposed to. You're the guest.
Oh, okay. Well, I feel like I need to take a breath here, Let somebody else speak for a moment. But in a nutshell, the passion behind IISB is about bringing Indigenous perspectives, knowledge, expertise forward, and so that it's accessible to the non-Indigenous world primarily, but in a way that would be honoring to Indigenous people. And when I think about our speakers, every single one of them is here not just on behalf of themselves, they're here on behalf of all of their ancestors and their communities. And so as Mama Bear of this organization, it's so super important to me that they are honored appropriately, not just for them, but for their ancestors who never would have received it for their knowledge and expertise, right? So yeah, it's a real privilege working here and being able to help bring to the forefront what I believe is truly, truly needed so desperately in the world right now, and that's Indigenous perspectives.
Amazing. And I love what you say about honoring them appropriately, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the remuneration that needs to take place, and that and it's much easier for a third party to come in and to kind of explain all that and to smooth the way and to ensure that their interests are taken care of. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've said this story many, many times, and I say it because it tends to shift the mindsets really quickly in almost like waking people up when I say this. But so I often say that, back in the day when in Indigenous communities, when people came to our community sharing their gifts of knowledge or expertise or story, that it was a communal norm to honor that individual to the highest. It was an understanding that the circle of honoring was about making sure that when something is given, something of equal or greater value must be given back for sustainability or for prosperity. Not that they would use those terms, but that's kind of the idea behind it, right? And back then that would have meant that that particular individual was fed, they were clothed, they were housed, and so were their families. And not for a day, but for a whole season. And that was, along with other gifts that they would have been given, right? And but today we can't go out and shoot somebody a buffalo, and definitely during COVID we can't bring anybody into our homes to live for a season, and the spirit behind that way of honoring can still be invoked. And what that means is making sure that these people that are sharing their gifts and their knowledge are able to that are remunerated so that they can go home, take care of themselves, take care of their families, and be valuable contributors to their community and help to elevate everybody. Because I often say, our land that we once were in partnership with, like that we were stewards of, is not ours anymore. As Indigenous people, or as First Peoples here, that is not necessarily the case. There's a lot of work to be done in that area, right? But the one thing that has not been taken is that ancestral knowledge or that intergenerational experience and expertise. And so that is precious, and it should be treated as so, because the rest of the world can learn so much from this. And they really, really need to right now on a number of different things, right? So yeah, so remuneration is super important to me. I mean, back to the communal thing, it's really hard for an Indigenous person to come forward and say, this is what I'm worth, pay me this or else. Are you kidding? That's taboo on so many levels in culture, right? It's like, who are you to demand that? But back then, they never would have had to. That would have been the communal norm to do that. They wouldn't have had to demand something that should rightly be in return for what they're giving, right? And so we get the privilege here at IISB to ensure that our speakers get to maintain that cultural integrity, of humility, that's important. Yet at the same token, make this an experience for clients that are coming forward, especially non-Indigenous, something that they're accustomed to, which is a business transaction. Let's negotiate. Let me tell you, let me hear. And when we do that, the one thing about IISB is we are not transactional. And what I mean by that is every single phone call that comes in is an opportunity for relationship. We're relational. And so when somebody comes forward with me, it's not about, oh, here you go, you can look at this person, you can look at this person, this is what the dollar is. Not at all. It's about having a conversation with that client and saying, okay, where are you at? Have you ever met an Indigenous person? If so, do you have policies and practices? And getting to know where they are as individuals and their organization, where they're at. From there, we can start to piece together where they need to go next and what are some options. And so we talk to them about that. We also talk to them about making sure that if expressing to them that this is about building relations with Indigenous people. It's not just about getting a speaker, checking a box. Though, if that's where they need to start, we'll help them along that journey to go further. And it's about making sure that they step out right at the beginning. So honoring again, and I do express that to them, you're not just honoring that speaker, you're honoring their ancestors too. So please don't come forward in a tokenistic way if you know what that means. If you don't know what that means, I'll be happy to share with you what that is. But, and then just giving them comparison, because if it was a non-Indigenous person, they'd have no question, And a lot of times, honestly, in this business, since I've been in it, I haven't really seen clients having an issue with paying Indigenous people what non-Indigenous people are getting. It's more that they never knew. They somehow have this impression that money is seen as a bad thing for Indigenous people. And I'm like, well, you're not going to get them a buffalo or, how else are they going to take care of their families? So when I convey that to them, they're like, oh yeah, right. And I'm like, no, for sure. Honor them so that they can take care of their families and communities. And they're more than willing, kind of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure if that totally answered your question or if it went way beyond answering your question.
That's great. No, that's awesome. I think it does speak to the heart of what the mission of IISB is, and kind of that relational piece. It's like reconciliation in action in a very real way.
Very, very real way. Very real way. I mean, I say, like, when people ask, well, what is IISB? I said, well, let me tell you about the results of IISB. Like, the results of us existing means that organizations, especially non-Indigenous organizations, business, educational institutes, have a resource that they can go to try and access Indigenous experts and knowledge keepers and so forth, and speakers, right? Primarily the speakers is what I want to convey to them. And the other results is that as a result of us existing is that Indigenous speakers are not alone anymore. Often when you're a speaker, you are an island and you're trying to make this work and go in. Unless you belong to a bureau of some kind that's working for you as an agency, then you're really out there hustling and bustling and just trying to convince people that you're worth listening to, right? I never, never, ever want our Indigenous people to ever feel that way, because they are worth listening to. And that is so, so important that, for IISB to make sure that that's conveyed both in the communications that we have about each speaker and when we're talking with potential clients. Because, feeling the power of my grandfather and my ancestors and my grandmother and that all here with me, and hearing especially my grandmother's voice over and over again in my head, there's more to us than the world knows. And I think there's reason for that. I think there was some divine timing in here. I mean, there's a lot of things that we're still coming through. The world's witnessing our, as John so eloquently said, we're seeing trauma still being played out, because literally we've lived through so much colonial trauma. And, but coming through that, watch out, world, because we are so going to be so equipped with so many solutions and perspectives and new ways of looking and doing things that will forever change the world. So, yeah.
That's awesome. One last question, just before we wrap up. What are some of the categories? I don't know. I don't want you to have to drop names, but just like some of the types of speakers that you have.
Oh gosh, I mean, anything you can think of, we've got people in that area. I think a lot of people think when they think Indigenous, it's like, oh, we're going to learn culture and we're going to learn history and dance or language or whatever. And you're absolutely right. You can learn that here. We have great experts in that. And every one of our speakers comes forward with culture that's inherent, in one form or another. But on top of that, they all come forward with their Indigenous lens in a field of their own expertise. And they're from all over. So for example, Dr. Keolu Fox, our Indigenous geneticist. And I love telling this story because it really gives a quick snapshot about how important it is to have the Indigenous lens in any boardroom and in any decision making. So Dr. Keolu Fox is one of only a handful of Indigenous geneticists in the world. And he's one of the youngest to have some of his research funded and so forth. But he's also the Indigenous geneticist that when he walked into that field of genetics, he just looked at them and said, whoa, you need to become more native. And what he meant was you need to become more diverse. And he said, how do you expect to find a cure for cancer or any other diseases when 95% of your clinical research is done on people of European descent and 96% of your clinical trials is done on people of European descent? You're not going to find a different, answer. And so, of course, there's some history that goes back to that, because in history, colonial history, Indigenous people were used as subjects of rather than partners of science. And so they didn't want anything to do with science. While Dr. Fox worked with organizations who created a genetic sequencing device that's the size of your telephone opposed to the size of a refrigerator, with specifically so that it was portable and accessible and able to be distributed to Indigenous communities, so that they could become partners in genetic research. They could do their own genetic research and contribute to the science. As a result, last year, before the pandemic took over our world, National Geographic did a wonderful interview with Dr. Fox in talking about how they found the genetic marker for heart disease and gastric cancer from the Indigenous community. Now they can go on to find a cure. Can you imagine? See, they just needed to have that Indigenous lens in there, changed everything. So yeah, so anyways, that's what makes my heart beat every day, is every one of these speakers comes forward with solutions that the Western world has never even heard of before. Yeah, and ways of looking at things. So yeah.
Well, that's pretty much all our time, but thank you so much for talking with us tonight. Our relative tonight, Shannon Loutitt from IISB, Niwagamaganuk, all my relations, and believe me, we are all related, so act like you've got relations. This is Auntie Andy signing out from Homelands, originally produced on CFCR Community Radio, 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory. cfcr.ca. You can find excellent programming on Indian and Cowboy podcasting. Follow us on Twitter at Métis Homelands. Or if you have comments, questions, or guest suggestions, email métishomelands@gmail.com. This episode will also be viewable on our YouTube channel, Homelands, so subscribe today. Marcy, thank you for listening. And Akoshi, Kawapa Matina Wahumina. That's all. We'll see you later.